What if I told you that billions of your tax dollars didn't just disappear, but that when people tried to stop it, they were shut down, ignored, or labeled as bigots? And what if I told you the federal government has finally had enough and just slammed the brakes on Minnesota's money pipeline? Because that's exactly what's happening right now. This isn't internet speculation. This isn't a partisan rumor. This is an official federal freeze of funding to the state of Minnesota. And it happened because Washington no longer trusts Minnesota to protect taxpayer money. Let that sink in. The federal government is saying, we don't trust you with our money anymore. Here's the core of it. Millions of dollars in annual federal support to Minnesota were abruptly frozen after federal officials concluded that the state had become ground zero for massive COVID-era fraud. Not millions stolen, billions, and not one program, multiple programs, food aid, healthcare, pandemic relief, small business assistance, all of it. The number that keeps coming up over and over again is $9 billion. $9 billion with a B. That's not a typo. That's not a rounding error. That's more money than many states spend in an entire year. And it didn't vanish because of one clever scam. It vanished because the systems designed to stop fraud didn't work or weren't allowed to work. And that's where this story stops being just about criminals and starts being about leadership. Because fraud at this scale doesn't happen quietly. It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen without warnings. It grows. It spreads. It gets noticed. And according to people inside Minnesota's own government, those warnings were ignored. Federal officials say Minnesota experienced a fundamental breakdown of public trust. That phrase matters. Governments don't use language like that casually. It means oversight failed, accountability failed, and the people in charge failed to correct it. So what did Washington do? They froze the money immediately. No grace period, no soft landing. Just stop until Minnesota can prove it knows how to stop criminals from looting federal programs. And before anyone says, well, this is just politics, let's be clear. This isn't about disagreeing over policy. This is about the government saying we are done risking taxpayer money in a system that keeps bleeding cash. And the bleeding wasn't subtle. Take Medicaid funding. Federal prosecutors have indicated that a staggering amount of program funding may have been lost to fraud. We're talking about programs meant to provide health care to vulnerable people, low-income families, children, people with disabilities, money that was supposed to help people survive the pandemic. Instead, large chunks of it were allegedly siphoned off through false claims, fake services, and shell operations that looked legitimate on paper and rotten in reality. And when investigators started pulling on those threads, the picture got worse. Organized fraud networks, coordinated schemes, money flowing out fast, oversight lagging far behind. Some estimates suggest entire categories of funding were compromised at levels that should have triggered immediate alarms, but those alarms either didn't ring or were silenced. And that raises a very uncomfortable question. How does something like this grow so large without someone stopping it? Because here's the thing, fraud at this level isn't invisible. It leaves trails, paper trails, payment trails, audit flags, growth curves that make no sense, programs exploding in size overnight, spending skyrocketing with no corresponding increase in legitimate services. That kind of pattern doesn't require genius to spot. It requires courage to confront. And that's where the story takes a darker turn. According to hundreds of current and former state employees, people inside Minnesota's own agencies tried to raise concerns. They tried to slow things down. They tried to ask basic questions like, are we sure these services are real? And why are these numbers exploding? And instead of being supported, they say they were sidelined, watched, pressured, discouraged. Some say outright retaliated against. Think about that. The people whose job it is to protect taxpayer money saying they were punished for trying to do exactly that. That's not just a bureaucratic failure, that's a cultural failure. And when leadership creates an environment where asking questions is dangerous, fraud doesn't just survive, it thrives. Now, defenders of the state leadership say this was inevitable, that when you expand aid quickly during a crisis, bad actors will try to take advantage, and that's true to a point. Every emergency program attracts fraud attempts, but here's the difference. In functioning systems, fraud gets caught early. It doesn't metastasize into billions. When fraud warnings are ignored, when oversight bodies are weakened, when audits are brushed aside, the message becomes clear, the system is open for exploitation, and criminals hear that message loud and clear. This is why the federal freeze matters so much. It's not symbolic, it's punitive. It's Washington saying you had your chance and you blew it, and the implications go far beyond Minnesota. Because if a state can lose control of billions in federal aid, what does that say about the safeguards protecting your tax dollars everywhere else? This isn't just a Minnesota problem. This is a national warning, and we're just getting started. Now, let's slow this down and explain how this actually happened, because the details matter. And once you hear them, it becomes very hard to believe this was just bad luck or unavoidable chaos. One of the biggest fraud cases centers around a federal child nutrition program. The idea was simple and good. During the pandemic, when schools were closed, the federal government sent money to help feed low-income children. Emergency rules were loosened so food could be distributed faster. Speed mattered, lives mattered. Criminals noticed that too. What followed wasn't some small-time scam. It was organized, deliberate, and industrial. Fake nonprofits were created. Paperwork looked clean. Claims said thousands of children were being fed every single day. Invoices poured in, and the money flowed out. Here's the key problem. Very little of it was verified in real time. So you had organizations claiming to serve massive numbers of kids with almost no physical proof, no meaningful inspections, no confirmation that meals were actually being provided at the scale claimed. And instead of asking, wait, does this make sense? The system kept paying. Hundreds of millions of dollars later, prosecutors stepped in, dozens of people were charged, convictions followed, luxury cars, expensive homes, overseas transfers, all paid for with money that was supposed to feed children. That alone should have triggered a total overhaul of how Minnesota handled federal funds, but it didn't stop there. Another program, this one tied to autism therapy, shows the same pattern. On paper, the number of providers exploded in just a few years, not by a reasonable amount, not by gradual growth, by several 100%. And the payments? They skyrocketed even faster. That doesn't happen naturally. Healthcare services don't suddenly multiply like that without something artificial pushing the numbers. And when investigators looked closer, they found providers billing for services that either never happened or were delivered by people with no qualifications to provide them. Again, the same pattern, fake compliance, real money. And here's where things start to feel less like negligence and more like willful blindness, because these numbers weren't hidden, they were in the data. Anyone looking could see the spikes. Anyone auditing honestly could see that something was very wrong, yet the system kept approving payments. And when concerns were raised by lawmakers, by auditors, by people inside the agencies, the response wasn't urgency, it wasn't transparency. According to multiple accounts, it was defensiveness. Instead of tightening oversight, Minnesota expanded programs. Instead of slowing disbursements, money kept flowing. And instead of welcoming scrutiny, the state allegedly pushed back against it. This is where whistleblowers come in, and this part of the story should bother everyone, no matter where you fall politically. More than 400 current and former state employees have said they tried to raise alarms. These are not outside activists. These are people whose job it was to administer and monitor these programs, people who saw fraud patterns up close. They say when they spoke up, they were ignored. When they persisted, they were sidelined. And when some went public, they feared retaliation. Think about what that does to an institution. Once people learn that asking questions puts a target on their back, they stop asking. And once that happens, fraud becomes unstoppable. That's how you get from millions to billions. And then there's the most toxic element of this entire scandal, the use of accusations to shut down debate. Multiple investigators and prosecutors have openly acknowledged that concerns about being labeled racist played a role in delaying action. That's not an opinion. That's a statement from people involved in the cases. Let me be very clear here, because this matters. Investigating fraud is not an attack on any community. Crime does not belong to a race, an ethnicity, or an immigrant group. Criminals exploit systems, not identities. But when leadership blurs that line, when legitimate oversight questions are reframed as bigotry, it creates the perfect shield for bad actors, because once scrutiny becomes taboo, fraud thrives in the dark. And that's exactly what appears to have happened at trial. Even jurors were targeted with messaging designed to make enforcement look discriminatory rather than lawful. That tells you something important. The fraud networks understood the political pressure points, and they used them. This is why federal authorities are now stepping in so aggressively, because from their perspective, Minnesota didn't just fail to stop fraud. It created an environment where stopping fraud was politically risky, and that's unacceptable when you're handling billions in federal funds. Which brings us back to the freeze. The federal government didn't just pause one small grant. They halted entire streams of funding tied to small business development, microloans, and support centers. Everything frozen until Minnesota can demonstrate real oversight, real accountability, and real enforcement. That's not symbolic. That's a warning shot. Because once Washington decides a state can't be trusted with money, the consequences don't stop at one letter, they escalate, and they are escalating. Congressional investigators are now demanding records, communications, internal memos, audit reports. They want to know who knew what and when. They want to know why warnings weren't acted on, and they want to know whether political considerations mattered more than protecting taxpayer dollars. This is no longer just about past fraud. It's about whether the system can be trusted going forward, and that question isn't answered yet, not even close. And this is where the story stops being abstract and starts becoming deeply personal, because now we're talking about responsibility, not just numbers. When federal investigators began digging deeper, they didn't just find fraud. They found patterns, repeated failures, the same mistakes happening again and again across different programs, different agencies, different years. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens when leadership tolerates dysfunction. Because here's something most people don't realize. State governments don't just passively receive federal money. They act as gatekeepers. They decide how programs are implemented. They set verification rules. They choose how aggressively fraud is investigated. They empower or weaken auditors. And in Minnesota's case, federal officials say those safeguards broke down at nearly every level. Oversight offices that were supposed to flag irregularities saw their findings ignored. Auditors issued warnings that went nowhere. Internal reports were allegedly brushed aside. And instead of tightening controls, agencies continued to approve funding at a pace that made fraud not just possible, but profitable. This is where federal prosecutors started using words like systemic, because when fraud happens once, it's a crime. When it happens everywhere, it's a system failure. And according to investigators, Minnesota's system didn't just fail, it stayed failed for years. One of the most alarming revelations is how much suspicious funding was flagged and still paid out anyway. Think about that. Loans and grants that internal systems marked as potentially fraudulent were approved regardless. In some cases, they were later forgiven, meaning the money was never recovered. That's not just negligence, that's surrender. And again, this raises a question that refuses to go away. Why? Why weren't these red flags acted on? Why weren't programs paused when the numbers made no sense? Why were warnings treated as annoyances instead of emergencies? Multiple insiders point to the same answer: politics. Not politics in the red versus blue sense, but politics as fear. Fear of backlash, fear of headlines, fear of being accused of targeting communities rather than criminals, and criminals sense that fear. This is something law enforcement has said repeatedly. Once bad actors realize enforcement is hesitant, they scale up, they test boundaries, they push further, and if nothing happens, they go all in. That's exactly what appears to have happened here. Fraud networks grew bolder, claims got larger, schemes got more complex, and by the time serious enforcement kicked in, the damage was already catastrophic. And here's the part that should make everyone uncomfortable. This didn't require secret knowledge, it required basic math. When a program grows by several 100% in a short period of time, someone should ask why. When payments jump by thousands of percent, someone should stop the line. When services exist only on paper, someone should knock on doors, but instead, the machine kept running. Now, defenders of the state leadership argue that the pandemic created chaos and that speed mattered more than precision. And yes, emergency situations demand flexibility, but flexibility without accountability is just an invitation to theft. And other states face the same pandemic. Other states ran similar programs, yet they didn't lose control at this scale, which is why federal agencies are now openly questioning whether Minnesota's leadership simply refused to act or chose not to. That distinction matters because refusing to act due to fear of political consequences isn't the same as being unaware. It's a choice, and that choice has consequences. The federal freeze sends a message not just to Minnesota, but to every state. If you don't protect taxpayer money, Washington will step in, and it won't be gentle. Multiple federal agencies are now involved: financial oversight bodies, agricultural programs, treasury officials, congressional committees. This is no longer a single investigation. It's a web of them, and once that web forms, it doesn't go away quietly. Lawmakers are now asking questions under oath. They want emails, text messages, internal discussions. They want to know who was warned and how leadership responded. They want to know whether concerns concerns were dismissed, minimized, or buried. They also want to know whether whistleblowers were punished for speaking out, because if that's true, the issue isn't just fraud, it's abuse of power, and that's where public trust really collapses, because citizens can accept mistakes, they can accept mismanagement. What they don't accept is being lied to, silenced, or told that asking questions is morally wrong. This is why the accusations of deflection matter so much. When leaders respond to oversight by changing the subject, by reframing fraud as prejudice, they poison the entire accountability process. And the end result is exactly what we're seeing now: billions gone, trust shattered, and federal authorities stepping in because the state failed to police itself. At this point, the question is no longer whether fraud happened. That's established. The question is how deep responsibility goes and who will be held accountable. And that question is about to get very uncomfortable. And now we reach the moment where this story stops being just about what happened in the past and starts being about what happens next, because the fallout is no longer hypothetical. It's already unfolding. Federal investigators aren't treating this like a closed chapter. They're treating it like an open wound. Congressional oversight committees are demanding documents, communications, internal warnings, audit reports, and timelines. They're trying to reconstruct who knew what when they knew it and why decisive action wasn't taken sooner. And that process is slow, methodical, and unforgiving, because once Congress starts asking questions under oath, the room for political spin disappears. And here's why that matters. This isn't just about criminals who exploited the system. Most of them are already being prosecuted. Some are convicted. More cases are still coming. That part is moving forward. The real question now is whether government officials enabled the environment that allowed this to explode. There's a difference between missing a fraud scheme and creating conditions where fraud becomes inevitable. Federal officials are increasingly signaling that Minnesota crossed that line. When auditors are weakened instead of empowered, fraud doesn't shrink. When oversight is treated as hostility, fraud adapts. When whistleblowers are feared rather than protected, corruption flourishes. And if those dynamics are proven, this becomes something much larger than mismanagement. This is why federal agencies are coordinating, Treasury officials are reviewing financial flows, agricultural oversight bodies are re-examining food program controls, small business administrators are reviewing how pandemic aid was distributed and forgiven, and law enforcement is following the money, domestically and overseas. That last part is critical, because once funds leave the country, recovery becomes almost impossible, and if even a fraction of that money was diverted toward criminal or extremist networks abroad, the implications go far beyond fraud. Now you're talking about national security risks created by domestic policy failures. That's not alarmism. That's reality. This is also why the funding freeze is so blunt. It's not meant to punish ordinary citizens or small businesses. It's meant to force reform. The message is simple: prove you can safeguard money or you don't get it. And that puts state leadership in a bind, because reform requires admitting failure. It requires acknowledging that systems were broken, warnings were missed, and mistakes were made. And politically, that's painful. But avoiding that admission is even worse, because as long as leadership denies responsibility, trust cannot be restored. And without trust, federal agencies will not reopen the money spigot. This is where some supporters of the state leadership push back and say this is all being blown out of proportion. But here's the reality. Federal agencies don't freeze funding over optics. They freeze funding when risk is too high. They don't step in because of one bad headline. They step in when patterns persist. And that's exactly what federal officials are pointing to: repeated warnings, repeated failures, repeated fraud across unrelated programs. At some point, coincidence stops being an explanation. This is also why this story resonates nationally, because Minnesota is not unique in expanding social programs quickly during a crisis. Many states did. The difference is what happened after the expansion. Did states tighten controls once the emergency phase passed? Did they audit aggressively? Did they shut down suspicious providers? Did they listen to internal warnings? In Minnesota's case, federal authorities say the answer appears to be no, and that should concern everyone, because if this can happen in one state at this scale, it can happen anywhere oversight is treated as optional, anywhere politics overrides accountability, anywhere leaders fear criticism more than failure. This is not a left-right issue, it's a competence issue. And that's why this investigation isn't slowing down, it's accelerating. More hearings are coming, more subpoenas are likely, more internal communications will be exposed, and as that happens, the narrative will either shift toward accountability or collapse under denial. And one way or another, the truth will come out, because when billions are missing, silence is no longer an option. Not for officials, not for investigators, and not for taxpayers. And that brings us to the final, unavoidable question: what does accountability actually look like? Because that question is about to define the outcome of this entire scandal. So now we arrive at the point where everything converges: money, leadership, trust, and consequences, and where this story stops being about spreadsheets and starts being about accountability in the real world. Because when billions of dollars vanish, the public deserves more than press statements and vague assurances. It deserves answers, clear ones. The first question is simple, and it's the hardest to dodge. When did leadership know there was a serious fraud problem? And what did they do with that knowledge? Not after prosecutors stepped in, not after headlines went national, but early, when the first warning signs appeared. Every large fraud scandal has a moment when it could have been contained, a point where stronger oversight, tighter controls, or even a temporary pause could have prevented disaster. Investigators are now trying to identify that moment and whether it was ignored. The second question is just as uncomfortable. Why were the people raising concerns not empowered but discouraged? Because if whistleblowers were sidelined or pressured, that changes the entire character of this case. That's no longer passive failure. That's active resistance to accountability. And let's be honest, no system fixes itself when the people inside it are afraid to speak. Then there's the political dimension, and this part matters whether people like it or not. If legitimate fraud concerns were softened, delayed, or dismissed because leaders feared being accused of prejudice, that's not social sensitivity, that's negligence. Criminals don't deserve protection because of optics. Taxpayers don't lose their rights because enforcement is uncomfortable. You can respect communities and still enforce the law. In fact, failing to do so harms those communities most of all. That's the irony here. The people hurt first by fraud aren't politicians or bureaucrats. They're the families who actually need these programs. When money is stolen, services shrink, trust erodes, and the programs were designed to help end up paying the price. That's why this isn't just a scandal, it's a warning about what happens when good intentions replace verification, when speed replaces safeguards, when politics replaces oversight, when leaders confuse compassion with carelessness. And this warning isn't limited to one state. Across the country, governments are being asked to manage massive sums of public money under pressure. Emergencies will happen again, crises will return, and when they do, this case will be studied, either as a lesson learned or a mistake repeated. The federal government's intervention sends a clear message: accountability is not optional. Oversight is not discrimination. And questioning how money is spent is not an attack, it's a responsibility. As for Minnesota, the path forward is narrow but clear: transparency, full cooperation, real reform, independent audits with teeth, strong whistleblower protections, and leaders willing to admit where things went wrong. Without that, trust won't return, and without trust, federal support won't either. So when people ask, why does this matter to me? The answer is simple: because it's your money, because it's your government, because if this can happen here, it can happen anywhere oversight fails. And because in a democracy, leadership isn't measured by intentions, it's measured by outcomes. Billions gone, warnings ignored, trust broken, and now a reckoning underway. The only question left is whether accountability will finally match the scale of the failure, or whether this will become just another case where no one at the top is ever truly held responsible. That question isn't rhetorical anymore. It's being asked right now by investigators, by lawmakers, and by taxpayers across the country. And this time, there's no pretending it doesn't matter.